Hey everybody, I want to follow up on an article I did last week. I called it Risk Illiteracy 2. I did it in the form of a blog post on bobshafut.com. I also posted it to LinkedIn. I want to follow up today on that same theme of risk illiteracy. I believe risk illiteracy, along with lack of sufficient board engagement, comprise two of the root causes that we're dealing with in terms of our, generally across all industries, poor performance when it comes to enterprise cyber risk management. You know the data as well as I do. You probably know it better than I do. We're spending more and more money. There are more and more breaches, more and more attacks, and we're doing less and less well than we ever have before. So here's the story today. This ball tire scenario was written by Jack Jones, a risk lens, a number of years ago, probably the first draft before 2015. There's a version of the white paper you can access in the link that I have on this page. It serves as a great tool to talk about what risk is all about. And if upon viewing this brief clip, it makes you angry, then you can blame me because I've angered lots of audiences going through this particular exercise. But if you happen to like it, you can thank Jack Jones for it. And I'll just say a quick thanks to Jack for the work that he did on this. It's very illuminating. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you 5 images over the course of this brief clip. And after I show you each image, I would like you to think about the greatest amount of risk that you see when you look at that image. For example, here's a ball tire. When you look at it, you see high risk, medium risk, low risk, or you may see no risk at all. In the end, I'm going to bring the 5 images together. I'll present them on one particular slide, and I'm going to ask you a question. What's the greatest amount of risk that you see in any one of the 5 images? Obviously, this is a recording. We're not going to have time for interaction. You won't have a chance to throw tomatoes at me, but we'll come to a punchline at the very end. So here we start out with a ball tire. At a certain point in time, it was probably used, does not appear to be in a car any longer. In this image, what I'm attempting to convey is that we've repurposed that ball tire into a tire tree swing. So our children and grandchildren can use it and enjoy it and have plenty of fun. When you look at this tire tree swing, given the information you have, how much risk do you see? High, medium, low, or no risk? Next, we'll move to a frayed rope. Next, we're going to move the tire tree swing to a cliff over, let me be melodramatic, the raging, beautiful Rogue River out in southern Oregon. And in this particular case, we have the tire tree swing 150 to 175 feet above the rocky, fast-moving Rogue River. And then finally, the 5th image is one showing a child, perhaps our grandchild, our daughter, our own child, using and enjoying the tire tree swing. So here's what the exercise is all about, as I mentioned. As you look at all of these images, and I want you to zero in on the one where you found the greatest amount of risk, what is that greatest amount of risk? Is it high, medium, low, or do you look at these and say, nah, there's no risk at all? And so here's the punchline. I'm sorry to tell you, there's no risk at all. We're looking at a bald tire. At a certain point in time, it was probably in somebody's car, in which case we probably called it an asset. The tire tree swing in the second image looks like a sturdy, good swing. And I guess if you had a Century 21 salesperson selling your home, they might add that in as a real valuable asset that's part of your particular property. I don't know. We could make up a lot of stuff about any of these images. The third image over on the top right-hand side is an image of a frayed rope. Is there any risk in that frayed rope? We don't know enough to be able to conclude that. What we do know is that it could represent a vulnerability if, under certain circumstances, it may be connected with that tire tree swing. I didn't make that connection, did I? We're human beings. Guess what we do? We make stuff up. Let's move to the lower left. Tire tree swing over the raging Rogue River, southern Oregon. Now, this is the one that usually trips people up. They look at that and they go, oh my God, that's got to be high risk. Well, tell me, and I can't do it quite as articulately as Jack Jones in his white paper, tell me about the loss or harm that occurs if there were to be a case where that bald tire went careening down into the Rogue River. We'd lose an old bald tire. What's the big deal? In order for there to be risk, you need to have the possibility of loss or harm. Now, this is the one where I have the greatest amount of arguments. Tomatoes are thrown at me, etc. And I've even had arguments with attorneys who have said, just declared outright, that's an attractive nuisance and therefore there's risk associated with it. Not by my definition, and I hope by yours soon. And then last but not least, the image of the child enjoying the tire tree swing in your backyard. This is probably the one scenario where we have an asset. The child. We don't usually go around calling our kids assets. I get that. But in this particular case, there could be loss or harm. We have an asset. Do we have a vulnerability? We don't know. It's not shown. If I told you the frayed rope was the one that's used in this particular tire tree swing, then we have a vulnerability. And what about a threat? Well, we don't know that either, except it's possible that the weight of the child exceeds the ability of that frayed rope to hold that child, in which case we have an asset and a threat and a vulnerability, but we don't know that yet. And so the point is that of these images, the greatest amount of risk that exists is no risk. Here are some fundamentals about risk and risk assessment. In order for there to be risk, there has to be the possibility of loss or harm. None of the images I showed gave you the information that there was an asset potentially in trouble and potentially could have the impact of loss or harm. Second point is that in order for there to be risk, as the graphic on the right-hand side indicates, there has to be an asset, a threat, and a vulnerability. As security professionals, you might think of it this way. Think about a laptop with sensitive information. Think about the threat being a burglar. Think about the vulnerability being no encryption or weak passwords. In fact, we could have a long discussion with 25 or 30 different scenarios surrounding a laptop as the asset and various threats and vulnerabilities. We won't do that here. Risk is also a likelihood issue. I didn't go down that path because we didn't even get to the point where we had a triple. But once you do have a triple, you need to understand what's the possibility or what's the likelihood of there being of that particular event, the threat, exercising or exploiting that vulnerability. And then once we understand likelihood, we need to make an assessment of impact. This now gets further along than we were because now we're getting into doing a risk rating. And then at the end, you need to think about risk as a derived value, just as we think about speed as being a function of distance divided by time. Here's a notional definition of risk I'll leave you with. Risk is a function of having an asset and a threat and a vulnerability. If something in the numerator doesn't exist, that is, if it's a zero, think about fifth grade math. What happens? You have a zero in the numerator. No matter how many controls you have in place, you're dividing into zero. It means nothing. There's no risk. Controls serving in the denominator, appearing in the denominator, serve to reduce risk. What happens when you divide by increasingly larger numbers? You result in a lower and lower, smaller quotient. Once you get that value, you multiply by the likelihood of the bad thing happening and the impact for it to happen. Here's the point. You need to define and know your terms. The failure to do this is what results in risk illiteracy. And I will tell you that, just as the image suggests, your cyber risk efforts are going to collapse. They're going to be ineffective. They're going to be inefficient, or all of the above, if you don't develop an agreed upon ECRM, Enterprise Cyber Risk Management Glossary. As Voltaire said, and I've quoted a million times over the last 30, 25 years, 15 years, if you're going to converse with me, define your terms. So if you're looking for some assistance in this area, many of you are aware my new book has just been published, Enterprise Cyber Risk Management as a Value Creator, Leverage Cyber Security and for Competitive Advantage. And in Appendix D, I define 25 essential terms for your Enterprise Cyber Risk Management Glossary that will help you build your glossary. Check it out on Amazon. Thanks for listening in, and I hope you help me solve the problem of risk illiteracy. Thanks again.